Well, none of us really likes to be told what to do and what not to do, right? There is something in all of us that resists being ordered around, bossed around, and when somebody does that, I mean, if they are our boss, it's one thing, but if they're not, we have that little kid kind of reaction. Well, you're not the boss of me, right? Now, when it comes to big things, we really usually try to follow those big rules. But, how many of us have gone a few miles over the speed limit when we don't see the police around anywhere? We may not go quite this fast, but it's 130 if you can't see it. But we might push it 5 or 10 miles an hour over the speed limit. We might throw away a cup or a wrapper or something like that, and instead of hunting for a trash barrel if nobody is looking. We might spin the truth to try to make ourselves look better at work or when we talk to our friends. We really, a lot of times, fail to take the Ten Commandments totally seriously today. And we forget that God's love is at the heart of the Ten Commandments. These things are not laws that God gave to deny happiness to people. As Adam Hamilton says, these are laws that God gave us to free us from the things that would enslave us. These are laws that God gave to give us life and not constrain us, but to help us live fully the way that God wants us to. And if we look at these 10 main commandments through Jesus' eyes, we see that they're essential for following God. Now, I'm going to be using some of these slides that I used several years ago. It was at the end of 2013, 5 years ago, that I did children's sermons with these. And you can learn the Ten Commandments by memorizing the old mnemonic, right? The old memory aid. 1 is the sun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a store, 5 is a hod, 6 is a stick, 7 is heaven, 8 is a gate, 9 is a line, 10 is a hen. Anybody ever tried to memorize a list using, you didn't ever try to use those things to memorize a list? These are really helpful because you can remember things, you can remember pictures much better than words. And even little kids can remember pictures better than words. If you don't believe me, try playing concentration with a 4 or 5-year-old, right? You ever do that? They're great at it because that picture memory is really sharp in those little kids. Okay, so the first commandment, 1 is the Son. Jesus is the Son of God, right? And Jesus is number 1. And so, God said, you shall have no other gods before me. Nobody ahead of Jesus for us as Christians. At that time, it was nobody ahead of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Last week I talked about the plagues of Egypt as a demonstration of God's power over the gods of Egypt. And if you were here, you might remember that slide with, there's, I think, like 4, 8, 13, yeah, there's 13 separate deities of the Egyptians on that slide, and they had a lot more. There were lots more beings that they worshiped, but worshiping something or someone other than God doesn't bring life and freedom. It brings bondage and death. And one of the problems that people had, if you've ever read like much Greek mythology, people were always afraid that they were making one god jealous by worshiping this other god over here, and it left them in a constant state of tension. Well, when God, the Lord God is our only God, we don't have to worry about those kinds of competitions. The second commandment, of course, was going on that mnemonic, two is a shoe. Think of a shoe on a grave, and the King James Version says, you shall not make a graven image or an engraved image or an idol of any kind. We're not supposed to make any idols of those false gods, or even, make an image of God. It's, of course, it's, there's that old story about the Sunday school teacher that asked the boys and girls to draw a picture of what they think God looks like, or to draw a picture. One little boy was there drawing, and she said, oh, what are you drawing? He said, I'm drawing a picture of God. And she said, oh, well, what does God look like? He said, I don't know, I'm not done yet. And so we're not to make any idol or an image that gives us kind of a limited idea of who God is and what God is like. The third commandment, 3 is a tree, and you can picture a tree with a weather vane on top there, right? So if you think of that tree with a weather vane on it, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, is the third commandment. And some people think that this commandment is about not cursing, but I agree with Adam Hamilton. I think it's more about not using God's name or influence to try to scare or take advantage of people or bully people. It's also not about using God's name as something insignificant that you just toss out casually. But we're to honor God in God's name. So we must not take God's name in vain. The fourth commandment, 4 is a store, and if you remember years ago, stores used to be closed on Sundays, on the Sabbath, and so remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. For the store is closed on the Sabbath, keep the Sabbath holy. This commandment helps people really keep in touch with the importance of our being rather than what we can do. Everybody needs to rest, recharge, and renew. And worship is essential for that process. Now, of course, there were times that it was difficult when everything would shut down on Sunday, right? It was awkward when, you were driving someplace and your car broke down and you needed a part, but you can't go to the store and get the part because it was closed because of the Sabbath. Or you had somebody in the family that got sick, but you couldn't go to the doctor because the doctor wasn't available, the hospitals were closed on Sunday or something like that. Like Jesus said, which of us, if we have a son or an animal that falls into a pit, won't go lift it out on the Sabbath, or lead an animal to drink on the Sabbath. Jesus made it clear that the Sabbath is for our benefit, and not us to be servants of the Sabbath. This commandment is to help us rest, recharge, renew, and refocus on God. The fifth commandment, since 5 is a hive, this is the one that turns from how we relate to God to how we relate to other people. Here's a beehive with father and mother bee in front of it. You see over there on the right. So the fifth commandment is to honor your father and your mother. Care and respect among generations is essential to preserve families and civilization. The sixth commandment, 6 is a stick. You can kill somebody with a stick. So you shall not kill, or you shall not commit murder. The Old Testament clearly included capital punishment and war at God's direction, but this commandment lets us know that life belongs to God, and it's not ours to treat casually. The seventh commandment, because 7 is heaven. Marriage is made in heaven, but sometimes we fall off that heavenly cloud and people split up. Sometimes that is necessary, I acknowledge, but God's intent is that we love one another and be faithful to one another. And Jesus extended this commandment to not even look lustfully at another person, because that's committing adultery in our heart. The 8th commandment, it's a picture of a steel gate telling us thou shalt not steal. Okay? And of course, this isn't just about robbing banks. It's not just about doing internet or phone scams, because it covers all the areas in our life. In Adam Hamilton's book on Moses, he told a story, and I know it's a true story, about a human resources director that was considering a person for a promotion with a significant pay increase. And the HR director was in the lunch line at the cafeteria behind this person being considered for a promotion, and noticed that before he checked out at the cash register, he took a pat of butter and stuck it underneath his napkin so he wouldn't be charged for it as he checked out. Well, later, she called that guy into his office, told him that he had been being considered for a promotion, but said, I will not put you in that position because I saw you hide that pat of butter under your napkin before you checked out. She knew that if he was dishonest in a little thing, he would be dishonest in big things. And she said, your integrity only seems to be worth about a nickel to you. Thou shalt not steal. Number 9. 9 is a line, and no lion. It's a pun. Okay, but you shall not lie. And that is not only just not giving false testimony in a court of law, but also covers passing on gossip that's untrue, or passing stuff around on the internet that is not true. Before the election, I tell you, we got more damaging and what would you call that? Just outrageous claims about candidates in the last presidential election, by one candidate in particular. And it was interesting when we found out that, yes, that the Soviet Union was in fact sponsoring some of those posts that people were passing around so easily on Facebook. The 9th commandment says not to lie. And the 10th commandment, 10 is a hen. And the hen covers the nest when she sits on it, so you shall not cover it, or you shall not covet. Okay, that shifts from deeds that harm others and desires to take from others to things about not desiring to harm or take from others. The commandment not to covet points to the ways that we might have a desire for something other than God. And the question is, going all the way back to that first commandment, in whom or in what do we find meaning in life? Is there anything that we want more than God? Think how much better the world would be if we kept all of these 10 commandments and followed them, these rules from God to live by. Well, but the fact is that all of us at one time or another have violated one or more of these 10 commandments. Another sermon that a friend of mine talked about one time is the way that if you break one commandment, in fact, you are breaking all 10. So, these things are all interrelated. And since all of us have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, it's necessary for us to come to God, to be forgiven, to be renewed.